There is something no one told you when you were sitting in that silence, replaying conversations you had already analyzed 100 times, wondering what you did wrong, wondering why nothing you gave was ever enough, wondering why someone who claimed to love you could make you feel so invisible. No one told you that the very qualities making you spiral into self-doubt, your attunement, your loyalty, your emotional depth, your capacity to absorb pain without breaking, were precisely the qualities they were never equipped to appreciate. You were not lacking. You were operating at a frequency they could not decode. And while you were shrinking yourself to fit into their narrowing definitions of acceptable, while you were apologizing for emotions that were completely valid, something was happening beneath the surface of that relationship that you were never meant to see. They were using you. Not necessarily with conscious malice in every moment, but with a structural dependency so deep, so automated, so wired into their psychological architecture that they did not even register what they were consuming. They were taking from a source they assumed would never run dry. And then you left, or maybe they discarded you first. Either way, something shifted. And the real story, the one that begins after the relationship ends, is the story almost no one prepares you for. If what you just heard landed somewhere in your chest, if something in those words made you feel recognized for the first time in a long time, subscribe to this channel right now. Not because of an algorithm. Subscribe because what you are about to hear, and what you will continue to find here, is the kind of psychological clarity that does not just explain what happened to you. It begins to dismantle the architecture of confusion that was deliberately built inside your mind. This channel exists for people who are done being gaslit, done second-guessing their own perception, done carrying the weight of someone else's emotional deficiency. Click that button and join a growing community of people who chose clarity over confusion and self-knowledge over the desperate need for external validation. Because understanding what happened to you is not just healing, it is power. When a narcissistic individual loses access to a primary source of supply, a partner who was emotionally attuned, consistent, giving, and deeply invested, the immediate reaction is rarely what you might expect. It is not grief. It is not remorse. It is not a flicker of genuine self-awareness. The initial response is almost always dismissal. This is not strength. It is an automated psychological defense that protects the narcissistic ego from registering loss as loss. In their internal narrative, they did not lose anything. They released something no longer useful. They upgraded. And this reframing is not something they are doing consciously to wound you. It is something they are doing unconsciously to protect themselves from a truth their psyche is structurally incapable of tolerating, that they needed you far more than they ever allowed themselves to acknowledge. To understand this properly, you need to understand what narcissistic supply actually is at a psychological level. Supply is not simply attention or admiration, though those are components. At its deepest function, supply is a regulatory mechanism. The narcissistic individual lacks a stable, internalized sense of self-worth. Their identity is not built from the inside out. It is constructed from the outside in, through the perceptions, reactions, and emotional responses of the people around them. Without consistent external input, their self-concept begins to fragment. They require an ongoing stream of reflections to remain psychologically stable. And you, with your empathy, your emotional intelligence, your tendency to absorb their moods and reflect them back in a way that felt like understanding, you were one of the most potent sources of that regulation they had likely ever encountered. Your empathy was not just kindness. It was a sophisticated attunement system. Your loyalty was not just devotion. It was a structural stability that buffered their internal chaos. Your patience was not just tolerance. It was an emotional container that absorbed their volatility and returned it to them refined. You were, without exaggeration, functioning as an external emotional regulation system for someone who never developed one internally. And they could not know that because knowing it would require a degree of self-awareness that is fundamentally incompatible with the narcissistic defense structure. To acknowledge what you provided would be to acknowledge their own deficiency. So instead, they minimized you. They kept you perpetually off balance, perpetually questioning yourself, because a partner who is destabilized cannot clearly perceive their own worth, and a partner who cannot perceive their own worth will not leave. This is the architecture of the trap. You were managed through intermittent reinforcement, through manufactured insecurity, through cycles of idealization and devaluation that kept you emotionally disoriented and therefore adhesively bound to the relationship. Every time they pulled away, your nervous system registered the threat of abandonment and produced a biochemical response that looked and felt like love, but was actually the neurological signature of trauma bonding. You were not weak. You were neurologically conditioned. There is an enormous difference. Now, here is where the timeline of their internal experience after your departure becomes psychologically precise. The first stage is dismissal, accompanied by a surge of what looks like confidence. They often move quickly to another person, to a social display of apparent happiness, to a performance of thriving that is calibrated to reach you. This is not evidence that they have moved on. This is evidence that their supply system is in emergency mode. The new person is not a genuine connection. They are a patch on a hemorrhaging wound. The narcissistic individual is pursuing that new person because their internal regulatory system is destabilizing, and they need an immediate influx of attention to stabilize it. But here is what they discover within weeks or months. The new source does not work the same way. What you provided was not simply attention or affection. It was a specific quality of attunement built over time through emotional investment, through the particular configuration of your empathy intersecting with their psychology. That is not replicable on demand. The replacement source is shallower, the regulation is less effective, and they begin to feel, without being able to articulate it, that something is missing. They will find fault where no fault exists. They will compare, and the comparison will not favor the new person, not because the new person is inferior, but because the new person is not you, and you were functioning at a level of emotional capacity they will struggle to find again. Subscribe to this channel right now, because what comes next? The psychology of why going back resets your recovery, why your nervous system will interpret their return as relief rather than warning, why the second cycle is always more damaging than the first. That content is here waiting for you. This is not a channel about victimhood. This is a channel about understanding the architecture of what happened to you so precisely that it loses its power to repeat itself. Join a community of people who are choosing to never be managed again. When the re-engagement attempt fails, when you maintain distance not as a strategy but because you finally do not have the energy to re-enter that cycle, something clinically significant occurs. The dismissal begins to crack. The narcissistic ego can withstand rejection from most people because most people are not psychologically significant enough to create a destabilizing absence. But you were a primary source, and a primary source that does not return carries an implicit message. The narcissistic ego cannot tolerate that they are not worth returning for. Beneath all the grandiosity, beneath all the contempt, beneath all the manufactured superiority, the narcissist's primary terror is the fear of being fundamentally worthless. Your sustained absence delivers a message directly to that core wound. You did not need them. You could survive without them. You could choose something better. This is when the obsessive rumination begins. Invisible to you, hidden beneath a social presentation of confidence and busyness, they are running an internal loop that clinicians recognize in the context of narcissistic injury processing. A repetitive, involuntary review of what happened, who was right, who lost more. The loop is not analytical, it is defensive. They are trying to find a framing that reinstates their superiority without requiring them to acknowledge either your value or their culpability. The problem is that the loop does not resolve, because honest resolution would require confronting the truth, that they mismanaged something exceptional. The comfortable conclusion keeps collapsing under the weight of reality. The cognitive dissonance you experienced is one of the most psychologically exhausting features of narcissistic relationship recovery, because the person who was cruel to you was also, at times, the person who seemed to see you most clearly. The person who caused you the deepest pain is also the person your nervous system still associates with safety, because they were the person you turned to for comfort, even when they were the source of the wound requiring comfort. This is the particular brutality of trauma bonding. It does not feel like a bond to a harmful person. It feels like a bond to the only person who fully knows you. Unraveling that distinction is the work, and it is not linear. It does not happen because you decide to be done. It happens incrementally, through understanding, through time, through the gradual accumulation of evidence that your life without them is not the diminished thing they implied it would be. Consider who you were in that relationship. Not the diminished version that emerged toward the end, the anxious, overextended, self-doubting person who rehearsed conversations before having them. Consider who you were before the erosion began. Consider the emotional intelligence you brought to that dynamic. Consider the capacity you demonstrated for managing not just your own emotional experience, but theirs as well, holding their moods, absorbing their projections, adapting your responses to prevent escalation. That capacity is extraordinary. That is not a description of a weak person. That is a description of someone with a highly developed nervous system and a profound capacity for relational attunement. The fact that those qualities were used against you does not diminish them. It means they were misdirected, invested in someone constitutionally incapable of returning the investment. The qualities that made you such an exceptional source of supply do not disappear when the relationship ends. They redirect. The attunement you spent on managing their emotional volatility becomes available for understanding yourself. The patience you extended endlessly in their direction becomes available for your own recovery. The loyalty that kept you in a harmful dynamic becomes loyalty to your own standards and your own future. These qualities do not need to be healed out of you. They need to be reoriented toward relationships capable of receiving them with reciprocity, with respect, and with genuine appreciation that the narcissist was never capable of offering. Your absence forces them to confront something they have been expertly avoiding their entire adult lives, their own interior emptiness. When you were there, absorbing their projections, managing their emotional regulation, providing the consistent external reflection that substituted for an internal sense of self. They did not have to face what exists in the absence of those inputs. But now the inputs are degraded. The replacement supply is insufficient. And in the quiet moments between the distractions, between the performances, they are left with themselves. And themselves, without the scaffolding you provided, is an uncomfortable, destabilizing place to be. This is not something you caused. This is something that was always there, beneath the persona, beneath the grandiosity. You did not create their emptiness. You simply provided the external architecture that made it livable. And now that you are gone, it is closer to the surface than it has been in a long time. The narcissistic individual can feel the loss, can register the regret at some level, and still be entirely incapable of doing what would be required to make that regret meaningful. The very psychological defenses that prevented them from valuing you while they had you are the same defenses that will prevent them from converting their regret into genuine growth. This is not said to suggest your hope for their transformation is naive. It is said because understanding this distinction between their feeling of regret and their capacity to act on it is the thing that finally releases you from waiting for an apology that will likely never arrive in the form needed to be genuinely healing. You do not need their admission of loss to know that you were a loss. You do not need their remorse to be confirmed in your own knowledge of what you brought to that relationship and what it cost you to bring it. Your responsibility, the one that matters, is to yourself, to the person who survived a relationship designed to consume you. You are rebuilding not just your sense of self, but your understanding of what a relationship is supposed to feel like, what it is supposed to cost, what it is supposed to return. You are rebuilding your template, that careful, psychologically informed reconstruction of what you will accept, what you will offer, and what you will recognize and walk away from. That is the most important work you will ever do. The next person who enters your life after this will encounter someone fundamentally different, not harder, not closed off, different in the sense of being more clearly defined, more precisely boundaried, more capable of distinguishing between genuine emotional reciprocity and the simulation of it. Your suffering, if you allow it to be metabolized into understanding rather than simply endured as pain, becomes the most sophisticated relational intelligence you could possess. You will know what you are worth because you have now seen the cost of accepting less. You will recognize the language of genuine appreciation because you know intimately the hollow imitation of it. You are not in recovery from being too much. You are in recovery from being invested in someone who was too little. And that distinction, precise, critical, and liberating, is the foundation upon which everything you build from here must rest. You were never the problem. You were the solution to a problem they never admitted they had. And now, in your absence, that problem is fully exposed, sitting in the center of their experience with no one exceptional enough to cover it. Subscribe to this channel. The strongest thing you can do right now is choose to keep going, keep understanding, and never again make yourself small for someone who was never worthy of your size. Click that button, not for a number on a screen, but as a declaration that you are choosing clarity over confusion, knowledge over ignorance, and self-possession over the indefinite wait for someone else to hand you back the sense of self you should never have been made to surrender. You were always more than enough. The only problem was that you were pouring that enoughness into someone who lacked the capacity to receive it. That ends now. This is where you begin.